Hello, welcome back to day 4 of 7 days of Halloween. Hi everyone, it's Monica, and welcome back to day 4 of 7 days of Halloween. So today, as promised, we're going to be doing some more stamping, and I'm going to be working with the stamp set that I got this Halloween season. Now, this isn't a new stamp set, but it's a really fun one because it has several different images. As you can see, it has the pharmacist image, which is really what I was going for when I bought the stamp. But you get so much more on the stamp set. And so often we buy a stamp set because we like one or two of the stamps, and then we don't end up using the rest of the stamps on the set. So I wanted to show you a way to use more than a few of the stamps on the sets that you buy. Now, granted, this is only going to work on some of the smaller stamp sets because if the stamp set is too big, this really isn't going to work. So the first thing that I did is I just got some white cardstock and I added my stamps to my MISTI so I can go ahead and stamp my images. Now, I was a little bit strategic when I placed my stamps, and I'll show you why in a minute here. I am going to be doing some die cutting, and I wanted to make sure that I had some room for the frame. Now, the die cut that I'm going to be using today is one of my favorites, and I've used it in the past to create postage stamp cards. And that's kind of what we're going to go for today, but with a little bit of a difference. We're not going to necessarily make a big postage stamp. We're going to cut out some of the small actually the smallest die we're going to use, and we're going to be cutting part of the image off. So I'm just adding the ink to my stamps because I want to make sure that they're nice and dark, and then I'm going to be adding some clear embossing powder because I'm going to be adding some ink over my images, and I want to make sure that my images don't smear. And then once I had my images all stamped, then I brought out my clear embossing powder. Now, clear embossing powder is probably the only embossing powder that I use. Well, not probably, it is the only embossing powder that I use. And the reason for that is if I want a colored embossing powder, then I'll just stamp with a colored ink pad. I have several colors of ink pads, and I use them a lot more than I would use my colored embossing powder. So that's the way I choose to go. And by using the clear embossing powder, I can just mix and match it with all of my inks. Now, I tend to use it more with my black inks. I don't use a lot of colorful inks. The only colorful inks that I use are my distress inks. I do have some other colorful inks, but I just tend to go with the black and white typically, unless I'm using my distress colors. But that's just a personal preference. Okay, so once I have my embossing powder over my images, then I brought out my heating tool and I'm going to go ahead and heat up my images so that way I can go ahead and cut them and color them up. Now, I know that we've all used heating tools before, but just another tip, you want to make sure that your heating tool is really hot. So this heating tool that I have is really good, and it was given to me by my mother-in-law. So it's one that I've had for a while, but it works really well. I don't even have to wait when I turn it on. I turn it on and it's instantly hot, and it will start embossing my images pretty quickly. So the name of the die set that I'm using is called Stacked Postage. And if you've seen some of my other videos, you know that I use this die a lot. And it's a really great die. It probably is one of my favorites. But ordinarily, when I use this particular die, I'm creating a bigger postage stamp. And it will usually take up an entire A2 card. But for this idea, I wanted to use the smallest die, and I wanted to focus in on the images and really tighten up the image to be able to make that a focal point. I wasn't really concerned about cutting off part of the image because that was the idea. I wanted to show you that you don't have to necessarily use the stamps the way that they're intended. You can die cut them, you can cut off part of them, and I really think that's what creates the unique cards is when you use the dies and the stamps a little differently. And then once I had all of my images die cut, then I just brought out various colors of my distress inks and my distress oxides to color up the background. Now, of course, I was somewhat strategic. I used the spice marmalade for my pumpkin, and then for the background, of the which I want to say that I used blue. And then for the skeleton, of course, I left him a little bit white, and then I added some of my my distress color. I think I used antique linen to color his face up. So I did kind of think about the colors that I wanted to use, but I wanted to use a variety of colors for the background. Now, for the most part, this is a one-layer card. Of course, I'm going to be having the postage stamps go onto the card, but when I say one-layer card, I'm not going to be adding a base or a top layer to the base of my card. And I do this very rarely, and the reason for that is because if I work directly on the base of the card, then it tends to get inky or have some color on the background, and I don't end up with a clean white card. And ultimately, that was the result of this card here. But I really wanted to show you the technique and not necessarily a crisp, clean card. I think if I were to do this again, I probably would have been a little bit more careful about my desk area and make sure that it was completely clean when I was working with my white card base. So just keep that in mind. If you are working with your card base and you have a lot of inks and colors going on, and you do want to make sure that you don't get any of those inks on your white cardstock, just be a little bit careful with regards to that. Now, I don't know if you noticed when I was working on the witch that I took my distress blender and I worked from the outside going in, and I left part of the background white, and that's because I wanted it to look like it was glowing, the moon glowing on the witch's face. So there are little things that you can do to add and enhance your images. You don't necessarily have to just add ink all over it. You know, if I have a face, I'm trying not to put the ink on the face, and while I still want just a color background, I still kind of take care to make sure that it does look somewhat realistic. It really didn't make too much difference on the pumpkin, of course, because the pumpkin is orange, so I could have an orange background as well as an orange face. But if you wanted to even get a little bit more creative, you might have a different color background on the pumpkin. So just play with your colors and be creative when you're putting together your postage stamps. And then as a final touch, I did add some walnut stain to the edge of my postage stamps. Now, walnut stain is always my go-to when I'm trying to edge up something and make it look a little bit more vintage. You've probably seen me use it several times in my videos that you've been watching, and that's because it is a staple in my craft room. I have it sitting right next to my media mat along with this little dauber, and it's something that I go to often. Okay, so like I mentioned earlier, I am working straight onto my cardstock. I'm not actually creating a panel that will be adhered to it. So I did want to go ahead and add some color. And rather than use my blending tool, I just took my antique linen and I put it right to the cardstock. I like things to look grungy, and that's really the look that I was going for. A lot of times when I am just working off of a plain white cardstock and I'm not going to be adding a panel to it, I will take the Oxide directly to the cardstock. And then to add a little bit more interest, I'm taking the alphabet stamp from an old set that's called School Desk, and I'm going to be adding some of these letters to the background. Now, another technique which you may have seen me use before is when I'm trying to create just some interest on a background, I don't necessarily take the entire stamp and stamp it on the background. I just take pieces of the stamp and I gently push down to just create some interest on my background. And then at this point, I'm going to go ahead and take my finished postage stamps and I'm going to kind of align them on the front of my cardstock. Now there's a couple of ways you can go with this. One idea is you can add some foam tape and have your postage stamps kind of stand up on the card, but I'm going to be adding some more once I get these postage stamps adhered to my base, and that's one of the reasons why I chose not to use foam tape for my postage stamps. And as you can see, the way that I'm lining up the postage stamps, you really do need to have not only horizontal but vertical stamps as well. So I went ahead and just got my adhesive and I started adhering the postage stamps down on my cardstock. And when I am putting these onto the base card, I am leaving some room in between. I didn't want it to make it too tight, and you're going to see why in a minute here. I worked from the edge in, so as I started to place my stamps, I started at the far edge because I wanted to have gaps. And as you see, when I'm putting together these images, I have nice gaps in between. And this was strategic. There were a few stamps that I didn't use in the stamp set, and I wanted to continue to show you how you can utilize most of the stamps in this set for this type of card design. Now again, when you are working with images or cutouts where you've added a lot of ink, you are going to get some of that ink on your fingers. And that is one of the problems that I've constantly had when I'm working with inky images, is my white cardstock tends to get fingerprints. I'm not really sure what the solution is for this, and maybe that'll be my question at the end of the video, if anybody has found a solution to try to not get inky fingerprints on their cards when they're working with inky images. But that's something that I constantly have a problem with. But as you know, I am not a person that necessarily has to have a perfect card. I embrace the imperfection, and I think that's what makes some of our handmade cards so unique and special, is they're not Hallmark cards. You can tell that we've put our blood, sweat, and inky finger prints on our cards, and it shows that you really did put your heart into a card. Okay, so once I had all of my images adhered, then I went back to my set and I pulled out some of the images or the stamps that I hadn't used yet. And one of the stamps that I hadn't used was the spider. And the spider was perfect for the background. I didn't realize that I was going to be using the spider when I started working on this design. My idea was to use those poison labels in between. But when I stamped the first spider, I thought, oh man, that looked really good. So I went ahead and I continued on with that. And you're going to see that I just initially was going to use those labels. And then once I started putting them down on the card, I thought, no, that the spider really was a great background. And so I continued with that part of the design. I know many of us go into a card design kind of have an idea of what the layout's going to be. But don't be married to the idea that you're going into. If you find along the way that there's something better that works, go for it. You don't have to be married to the original idea. You want to probably go into creating a card with some sort of an idea, because you're going to want to have your tools and your inks and whatnot pulled out. But you don't necessarily, like I said, have to be married to the original idea. When I first stamped the spider stamp, that was the very top one, I didn't realize I was going to use the stamp on the left, and then again you're going to see I'm going to use it in the middle here. But it just really worked. So if you're going along and you find something that works, I would just say embrace it. Now, before I finish off the card, there is one other product that I wanted to share with you, and it's one that I haven't used this season too much. I've used it in my past videos, and these of course are the remnant rubs. I have a good supply, so I didn't actually invest in buying some more this season. But these remnant rubs are really great when you're creating ATC cards or anything where you have a small image, because you can add these little words, and these words are small, but they're perfect for the postage stamps or any of your ATC cards. And there's so many choices. Tim has a Halloween set. He also has a Christmas set, but then there's also just some generic sets as well. And in the remnant rubs, not only are you going to find the small words, but you're going to find some images and numbers, and there's just a lot of variety to be able to add to your cards. So if you've never used the remnant rubs before, they're not very expensive, and I would say they're worth a try just to see if it's something that you would like. So once I added the remnant rubs, my card pretty much was complete. So I hope that you've enjoyed the 4th card in my 7 days of Halloween. For this particular card, I tried not to go too creepy. I wanted to create a card design where you can share it with someone that may not necessarily be into all the ghouls, but still will get a sense of the Halloween spirit. And this design will work not only for some of these creepy stamps, but any of your smaller stamps. Don't be afraid to cut off the edges and tighten them up, because it really does change the whole stamp. So as always, I'll leave a list of all the products I've used to create the card along with the links to the stores. If you've enjoyed the video, don't forget to leave me a thumbs up. And if you haven't subscribed to my channel yet, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. So the question of the day is going to be as follows. Do you have a solution for when you are working with white cardstock and colored inks to not get your fingerprints all over the cards? If you do, I would sure love to know what that solution is. And I'll use your comment to enter you into a drawing at the end of the series for one of my prizes. I haven't quite decided what I'm going to give away yet, but I'll figure that out at the end. All right, everybody. Thanks so much for stopping by, and we'll see you again tomorrow.